Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I got to say, I've been working on. I'm going to talk about trade. It's going to be a bit bigger picture than maybe the previous two presentations, which I learned a lot from. And I'm a little worried that my presentation's a little bit silly, actually, compared to the previous two. But we'll see. There's a lot of pictures. I hope you enjoy it. Trade. I've been working on trade with the NFU actually for a long time now, and really at the CCPA, at the Trade Investment Research Project, where I coordinate that trade work, it's really we're kind of dependent on the NFU for a lot, almost basically all of what we know about the impacts of trade on farming communities, on agriculture, and that kind of thing. And so it is really nice to be here and with all of you, and to see some familiar faces too. I even see some non-farming members of the Trade and Investment Research Project here, like Jamie and Lucy as well over there. Lucy shared, not to point you out, but sorry, I just did. So you know, we're talking about confronting power. I'm looking at it in the sense of the global trade architecture, essentially. And this is an area where obviously everybody in this room probably knows as much as I do about free trade and the fights against free trade over the past 30 years. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. There have been some victories, but honestly, when you think about the span of history, like where things went since 1985 when we started negotiating with the United States, it's not necessarily pretty, as we'll get to here in the next little bit. But just in a sense of the flow of my presentation, and I hope I don't take up, I'm going to try not to take up the full 20 minutes because there's been quite a lot. It'd be great to get to some questions. You know, there's a scrapbook of moments in the making of the contemporary and I would say contested global rules-based order. Okay. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Okay. Yeah, like a bit of a scrapbook. So just, again, going over stuff that everybody here knows, how we got to where we were and some of the big fights we've seen against the global trade regime, corporate trade agenda, if you want to call it that. I'm going to talk second about an opening for trade justice in the current kind of destabilizations happening in that order. I don't think anything is as certain as it was, say, maybe 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. And where things are unstable and uncertain, there's room for politics, and there's room for us to come in and pushing our own versions of what we'd like to see for those trade rules, or getting rid of the ones we don't like. And then I'm going to give a few examples of where I see that happening. You know, again, not clear-cut, not black and white, we're winning, but areas where we're making gains, and where I think we have to push. So that's that. Here's the first scrapbook. Again, I put these up here, like going from the Mulroney-Reagan era free trade agreement, the first one, Canada-US free trade agreement, signed in 1988. I think I put this together here to show that Canada's played actually quite an important role in spreading the rules of free trade to the global level. We were the first country, essentially, to sign this deal with the United States, taking conversations that were going very slowly at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, taking them at that level and saying, we're willing, we're going to go gung-ho into this kind of thing with the United States. Very quickly following up again with the NAFTA, which essentially was, if you look at the NAFTA and you compare it to the WTO agreements that were established in 1995, after the signing here of the Marrakesh Agreement, they're essentially identical, right? So again, Canada, the United States, Mexico, forging ahead, showing that it can work, and that leading then towards this kind of globalization of these rules as well. I end here with CETA, which is, you know, the Canada-European Union Trade Agreement, which, again, the NFU played a very big role in contesting at the time, from 2009 up until 2016. Because, you know, to me, this is, well, one, I didn't have any room for any more photos, but to me, this was like a nice moment where we start to see things kind of fall off the rails for this agenda, this very specific, keep on the bicycle, let's further and further liberalization, further and further restrictions on policy space. It kind of comes off the rails for obvious reasons. We'll see in a slide coming up. So over this time, just to say, it wasn't just signing trade agreements and like us losing all the time and, you know, further entrenching of the corporate agenda at the global level. We've been contesting this from the beginning, right? So if you look at the Canada free trade debates, Canada-US free trade debates of the 1980s, the distinction I'd like to make, and I'll show it in other slides, is we've been there since before all of this was normal, right? So the generation going into power now has never lived in a world without free trade, without these rules constraining what we can do as governments. Back then it was kind of from without. They were fighting this force coming at them. There was a chance that it would be toppled. There was a chance we would see a different future. And as you see from the kind of chain of events, there has been resistance since then, very strong, and it continues up to this day. But where we were once outside, fighting up against it, we are now totally inside, overwhelmed. And this is from 2005. They call it the spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements, kind of wrapping up every country in the world. And of course, with the WTO, some would say that was that, right? I mean, when you establish those rules at a global level, the rest since then has been tweaking. But essentially, there we have it, a brand new world. We're fighting from the inside now, right? Like, we're fighting up against these things as best as we can from the inside. So what do the agreements do? Again, I'm just going to say again, like, you all know this stuff, and I know that because the NFU has been fighting these agreements for all these reasons for a long time. I would say, like, obviously they do a lot of things that aren't necessarily trade related. The first one here on agriculture, like lowering tariffs on goods, when you think of agricultural products, textiles, clothes, that kind of thing, this is the one we think of most, and it's the one that news coverage of trade deals always focuses on. You know, in terms of fights between different groupings of food producers in one country and another, and who's getting more screwed than the other group of farmers by the agreement. These treaties are, in a sense, though, if you look at all of these elements here, right, they deal with services, they deal with how you treat foreign investors. They deal with regulation, and Tim was mentioning the dispute with Mexico, right, with respect to the corn decrees. This is a fight against Mexico's right to regulate its food sector in a way that it sees fit. And so you have these incredible restrictions on food and safety standards you can put in place. They have to be based on international standards that may or may not have been developed primarily by the food companies, Monsanto and other intellectual property holders themselves. So just to say that these treaties overall, we can say that they're a blueprint for governing in every area for the global economy. There's a set of limits on democracy based on the idea that there's no better way to organize production than the market, no more efficient use of resources, and that the less friction governments add through regulations and other public policies, the better we'll all be. So the thing is, you know, if we go back to the kind of inflection points there, people recognize that today, right? People recognize that 30 years into this agenda, things didn't really go as everyone had been promised, right? Like, jobs didn't explode and grow in every country. There wasn't this, you know, massive growth in more wealth equality among people, right? Like, inequality has grown in this period. We've seen a rapid degradation of biodiversity, of the soil. We've seen climate change worsen, like massive production on, you know, when you think about the scale of the production and the scale of the trade. And so we're in this kind of wobbly phase, I say, of globalization. Of course, there's the Trump aspect, right? I mean, there's the Trump coming along in 2016 and ripping up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or at least pulling the United States out of it. But we've seen these other things happening in the same period. You know, going back to the Great Recession, things are not going well for the global economy. It's been a period of slow growth across the board, but also high profits. And now we're having war come into play, and we're having massive, as I'll show in the next one here. I put this slide here on the bottom of the TRIPS waiver, right? We've had the pandemic come into play as well and throw doubt on how secure our supply chains are for a number of goods, whether it's medical supplies, supplies of food. Basically, you know, there's a mistrust in the whole system that's been built to regulate trade over this period, and these various events, overlapping events, have kind of fueled that mistrust to some extent. And I put this here just to show that obviously the climate crisis, to me, is you know, the most important thing we have to deal with. Something that a lot of the trade pushback we've seen from Trump and other sources doesn't necessarily deal with, but is having an effect on our sense of the global economy, having an effect on global supply chains as well, and having an effect on human and non-human life across the world. And something we have to deal with pretty drastically and rapidly, and in ways that might actually go against the trade rules we've established, right, up to this point, which are quite restrictive. Okay. So, as I said in the beginning, the second thing I'd like to talk about is trade justice. And this is, the NFU and the CCPA are members of the Trade Justice Network in Canada. And basically, I pulled this from an Oxfam report from 22 when trying to think of what is trade justice. So compared to, say, corporate-based trade or neoliberal trade or whatever you want to call it, trade justice is an alternate approach that is being pushed that would basically make trade kind of subservient to other objectives that are obviously, I think, more important. For example, equality. They put a bunch of packages Oxfam did into that aspect of it. We want trade to benefit everybody more or less equally, right? We don't want trade to be impoverishing some people and making some people in New York or whatever extremely rich, if you see what I mean. We don't want the kinds of things that are facilitated through trade, for example, extractive projects, mining and production, factory work in other countries. We don't want it to be perpetuating human rights violations, right? Or undermining labor rights in the process, right? So basically it's turning things on its head, and it's saying these priorities are much more important, and if they are important to us, then we have to reform our trade system, our trade architecture in a way that brings these things into being, right? So 3 examples of trade justice wins, and I just wanted to again clarify that these aren't complete wins. I just think these are areas where we have fought together. For a long time we've been fighting these issues together. Maybe not digital trade so much because it's a relatively new area, but on investor-state dispute settlement and these extreme investor rights that we build into trade agreements. We've been fighting them a long time, and it's having results. Let's go to the first example. Countries are terminating investment treaties that they signed from the 1990s on through the 2000s. And they're doing so to expand their ability to regulate foreign investment, right? To make sure that the investment coming into their countries, establishing companies, putting down mines or figuring out ways to sustainably mine, for example, that it's not undermined by these treaties, which essentially give the investor enormous ability to set the terms of its own operations in those countries, and to sue the government when a future government, or even that government, decides that it wants to get a better deal out of the investment, or wants to enforce human rights, for example, or enforce its environmental standards on that company. Just a litany of cases. There's been, I think, over 1,200 now investor-state dispute settlement cases that have been filed against governments. And the awards that are handed down to these companies from these 3-person private tribunals, right? It's not a court deciding whether or not your policy is violating this investor's rights. It's a tribunal made up of trade lawyers and investment lawyers who are normally quite favorable to the corporate interests of the companies involved. So you can see just an enormous number of treaties that are being canceled, terminated completely by countries like South Africa, Ecuador, India, and I'm going to put us down there too, and Canada. So this is a quote that maybe you've seen before from Minister Freeland from October 2018, when Canada celebrated the fact that it had removed the investor-state dispute settlement process from the new NAFTA, from the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, because, hard to read that I guess, because in removing it we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest to protect public health and the environment, right? So we thought, this is great. This really was, this wouldn't have happened. Yes, it was a US request that Canada begrudgingly accepted, yes, but it wouldn't have been possible if there hadn't been so much public opposition to ISDS in the United States, among labor unions, among environmental groups, and I would say in Canada as well. The reason Freeland is speaking to us, critics there, right? She's saying, we hear you, this is a good thing that we did. And I think that shows the strength of our opposition to ISDS. Whether or not they kept their promise here or kind of are consistent, because they're not. They're all over the place signing new treaties with other countries. But this to me was an important win in a sense. We're seeing it in Europe as well. So Europe, Canada, the United States, these are the major signers of investment treaties. And you're seeing in the European Union right now a major rethink of whether or not these are good things to sign. And it's directly related to governments who realize that these treaties actually are totally against the objective of meeting the Paris climate agreements, totally get in the way of putting into place just transition policies for energy sectors, stopping the production of new oil and gas infrastructure, these kinds of things, and have decided to do a coordinated withdrawal from the Energy Charter Treaty, which is the world's most used investment treaty for protecting with an ISDS system. So again, this is kind of rippling through the world right now and really inspiring countries around the world to continue to push up against and scale back and hopefully cancel the web of investment treaties. I mean, there's hundreds of free trade agreements. There's thousands of investment treaties covering all countries of the world, and these need to be scaled back, and we have momentum. With respect to digital trade, and which you heard about today already, maybe not the trade aspects, but in terms of the dominance, right, of certain companies in the realm of data collection and what they can, the power that gives them in a sense, right? We're at a moment right now in trade governance, in new trade agreements, for example, that we were kind of at in the early 90s when Pfizer and other drug companies were writing the rules of trade, writing the intellectual property rights chapter of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the agreement within the WTO, writing their own rules for global protection of their own intellectual property. We're at that exact same moment now where big tech, Silicon Valley companies are writing the rules of digital trade and getting them put into new agreements. And yet here we have in the Biden administration, based on union opposition, antitrust groups, people pushing against the power of big tech in the United States, they're saying we're no longer committed to some of the worst elements of those digital trade chapters, which maybe we could talk about in the question and answer session, and saying we're withdrawing proposals at the WTO that would, for example, prohibit countries from requiring that data centers be based domestically, right? If you're going to establish some kind of data collection, the data should stay here. And basically making it difficult to regulate big tech in the future, you know, for reasons of protecting privacy or for reasons of simply, you know, reducing monopolies in the digital sphere. Again, this would not have been possible. Yes, even though there is an element of, you know, pushing back or worried about China in Biden's decision here, like yes, there's an element of not wanting to be able to discriminate in their own laws potentially against Chinese competitors in a lot of these tech areas. However, again, this is speaking to the opposition to these extreme corporate digital trade rights when they make this reversal. And finally, just to mention inclusive trade, the whole concept, right? As I was saying, like everybody recognizes now that these trade agreements do not produce the effects we were promised. They do not produce the enormous amount of good jobs and everyone's happy and, you know, things just keep getting better. But in fact, they create a lot of people who don't win out, who actually are worse off at the end of the day. And so you have this attention, even in Canada and other countries, to inclusive, worker-focused trade. A lot of it is surface, like honestly, and probably people in this room know that just as much as I do. A lot of it is surface, but a lot of it is also there because of campaigns, right, to reform the trade agenda. And like I said at the beginning, we're kind of stuck. We're in the inside. There is no outside to free trade. There is simply a global economy ruled by these rules. And we are at the moment then where, I think about Gavin Friedel, he's a member of the Trade Investment Research Project. He talked about the inclusive trade ratchet, you know. We have seen some gains on worker rights in the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. There is now a method where unions in Mexico or any country can say, well, our rights are being violated at this facility right now in Mexico, for example. Please investigate and do something about it. And the United States has used this thing 14, 15 times so far, and every time has resulted in, say, workers being reinstated, or a slap on the wrist of the company union that was basically trying to avoid a fair vote for a new union down in the country. So votes have been reversed on collective agreements, workers have been reinstated, back pay has been paid. This thing is actually quite interesting, right? And so if we want to ratchet that into other agreements, then I think we have the political space to do that. And again, if we can do it there, we can do it in a number of other areas, would be my point. So, you know, even though we've lost in a lot of spaces, I think we can't give up. We do have more space, more voice because things are so unstable right now, because there's no certainty, right? There's no longer any hubris about this great free trade model we were promised in the 80s. There's uncertainty, there's instability, there's power, there's contestation, right? And that's where we have to enter the fray and push for the world we'd like to see. So thanks very much, and look forward to questions.